Greetings, everyone. This is the NOAA Fisheries Seminar, Ecosystem-Based Management, Ecosystem-Based Fisheries Management, the monthly seminar series offered on the second Wednesday of every month. Today's speaker is Chris Harvey from our Northwest Fisheries Science Center, and he'll be speaking about EBFM and where we all fit in, with a focus on the implementation and operationalizing these efforts. Next month, we have a presentation on November 14th by Jamie Gove and Jerry Davis from our Pacific Islands Research Office and Science Center, and they'll be talking about scaling science to support ecosystem-based fishery management in Western Hawaii. So I will turn the presentation over to Chris Harvey now, who is presenting from his office in Seattle. So thanks, Chris, for joining us today and presenting.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay. Well, good morning or good afternoon to everyone who's on. I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to talk today. Just occurs to me to send my best wishes to folks in the Southeast that either have been or are currently experiencing hurricane weather, and we hope everything is going well for you. I also wanted to just maybe give a quick preamble on this talk. The motivation for it, this is a talk that I hope is going to be unique relative to ones you've seen before. And what motivated me to do it was that I feel like over the last couple of years, the number of ecosystem-based fisheries management or ecosystem-based management related initiatives and messages and priorities that we've been hearing at NOAA has been increasing quite a bit. And I was both a little concerned about how to put all these pieces together for my own work, and also sensitive to some of my colleagues that might not be as involved in ecosystem science right now, and worried that they might be feeling like this was leaving them behind a little bit. And so the presentation I'm about to give is an expanded version of one that I gave at the Northwest Science Center in Seattle several months ago, and just an attempt to welcome people into all these things that are going on. So without further ado, NOAA scientists work in a really wide range of settings across a lot of disciplines, like our folks that are working out at sea, people that are working in more inland habitats and all the way up into freshwater, folks that do their science at the lab bench or at the computer, and so a wide array of talents and disciplines. But for as long as we've all been doing this, I think we've been getting these messages from headquarters about the importance of ecosystem science. And for a long time, I think people would hear this drumbeat of ecosystem science and think, well, I do that already, or other people might think, well, what does ecosystem science mean? And perhaps before they got satisfactory answers to those reactions, the messages continued to evolve. Over the last 10 years or so, a lot of the messages that have come from headquarters have been about this thing called IEA, still ecosystem science, but now we're talking about integrated ecosystem assessment. Same deal. A lot of people might think, well, what's that all about? Over the last 2 years, the message has evolved even further. The same voices were starting to refer to this thing called the EBFM roadmap. And earlier this year, a new term came across our screens that was so big that it required a bigger monitor to really capture transformational ideas. So we're seeing this big push for ecosystem-based science and ecosystem-based fisheries management, and the related work, it's all evolving quite quickly. So quickly that it's pretty easy to lose track of it and not really know how it all fits together. So in this presentation, I'm going to try to give a high-level viewpoint on science in support of ecosystem-based fisheries management and ask, where do we all fit in? And so the topics I'll go through are, first, what is the EBFM roadmap? Also, what is IEA and how does it relate to the NOAA mission? What are those transformational ideas that I referenced before? And ask, is the management system ready for EBFM? And finally, how could I get involved if I'm not involved in it already, or just wondering how it all might fit together better? I must warn you that this presentation is going to be a metaphor parade, and I hope you excuse me. I like to talk in metaphors. I think it's an effective way to communicate, and we'll see if I'm right or not. The first metaphor that we're going to dive into concerns the EBFM roadmap. But before we get that far into the EBFM roadmap, let's first think about stock assessments and take a way too simple overview of what stock assessments are. Featuring our friend here, this is a sablefish, one of the most valuable fish on the West Coast and up in Alaska. The purpose of, and I'm not a stock assessment biologist at all, so excuse me for the generalizations I'm about to make, but the background of any assessment is a lot of work that goes into data collection by our scientists out in the field. And that data collection tends to focus on things like how much reproductive output a stock is capable of, how many individuals are in that population and how big they are, how old they are. If we can manage to, we'll try to study how many of them die of natural causes, and we certainly try to keep track of how many are caught in fisheries. So smart stock assessment biologists take all that data, wrap it all together in a stock assessment model that gives a clearer picture of the status of the stock and helps to guide harvest policies. And we generally assume that the amount of variability in the ecosystem is sufficiently captured in all the data that we collect so that the stock assessment model, it's not perfect, but it performs well, well enough on average that we can use it to make harvest policy. That's been the traditional approach of stock assessment science as presented to you by someone who doesn't actually do it himself, but watches other people do it. Now, if you're an ecosystem scientist, an ecosystem ecologist like I am, we worry that there is variability that's introduced by the ecosystem that sometimes influences or disrupts those processes that are in that stock assessment. For example, climate variability or climate change could disrupt some of those processes. So could dramatic changes in the availability of food or other species in the food web. We worry about changes in water quality or other aspects of habitat quality, such as ocean acidification. And then we also recognize as ecosystem scientists that these species are interacting very importantly with people. And the status of a stock could change as a result of whether, let's say, market pressures in the fisheries industry drive people to fish for more of or less of a species like a sablefish. So there's all this complexity wrapped around the species biology that could affect the biology in a way that an assessment model just can't capture, especially if these things are changing quickly. And so in that light, the agency adopted an EBFM, an Ecosystem-Based Fisheries Management policy back in 2016, following decades of work on identifying the importance of these factors in fisheries science. The policy is intended to promote the sustainability and the resilience of the ecosystem as a whole, in addition to the target species that we manage. It also recognizes that these species are affected by a broad range of interactions, and importantly, it includes people as part of the system, part of the ecosystem, rather than these outside actors on it. So we're in this too. And to that end, the ecosystem-based fisheries management policy is intended to optimize diverse societal goals. So those would be goals for different people that want different things out of the ocean. Sometimes those goals are in sync with each other, sometimes they compete. The policy outlines 6 guiding principles for how to implement EBFM, and I'll go into those a little bit later, but that's just an important thing to keep in mind is it's got these 6 guiding principles for how we are expected to implement it. And the implementation plan we refer to with the nickname the EBFM roadmap. EBFM roadmap, that sounds like a metaphor, so let's go ahead and jump right into the next metaphor here. And if we think of our research career, let's say you're a NOAA scientist and you've just heard all about this EBFM roadmap thing that is supposed to help drive this new policy that was just adopted in 2016. That sounds a little weird. If you think of your research as this journey that's outlined here on the map, you've got an idea of where you're starting, you got an idea of your destination that you've agreed upon with your boss, with people that are funding the research, with people that are out there who want to catch fish, people that are out there that want to conserve resources, all sorts of different people. And to that, pulling all that together, you've identified this X as where you're headed. And let's say you're making some good progress on that work, you're about this far along, you've done a lot, you know there's a lot still to be done. Suddenly, you get this email that tells you that there's actually this other X way, way over there related to this EBFM policy. And what does that mean for you? Does that mean that you're supposed to stop the work that you're doing and head off to this new destination? Does it mean that you just keep up what you're doing and you get to the next thing coming from headquarters when you can, or do you just put your head down and hope that it goes away if you ignore it long enough? Well, if we do think of this map as a metaphor for the EBFM roadmap in NOAA, I hope the answer is an encouraging one for all of us, because the way I see it, these EBFM roadmaps, which as I mentioned are customized plans to implement the EBFM policy, these are being adopted at the national and regional scales, and they describe these milestones, activities that each region can undergo to meet those guiding principles that are in this policy. Here's the encouraging part. The EBFM roadmaps are designed to be put to use in 5-year iterations, and the first one is already underway. We've just wrapped up public comment on it. And nowhere, in my opinion, or in my experience, does this first iteration of the roadmap say, stop what you're doing, stop heading toward the X that you've been working toward, and start going toward this other X instead. It should not be to do that, because that would be just gigantically unreasonable, impossible, and unnecessary to stop what we're doing and reorient. Instead, it should be preparing us for the second iteration of the roadmap that will come 5 years from now. That'll be more coordinated, more proactive, and more strategic after we've taken the time to prepare for it. Just to give you an example from the West Coast roadmap, which I'm a participant in, one of the guiding principles that I mentioned before is guiding principle number 2, which is to advance our understanding of ecosystem processes. And some of the proposed milestones for that guiding principle in the West Coast roadmap include things like taking an inventory of objectives, mandates, risks, and so forth. Then aligning that inventory to our own research priorities to see how well we're prepared to meet those and identify what the gaps are. And then finally to start developing strategies for closing those gaps. And we would do that closing probably in the second iteration of the roadmap in 5 years. There's nowhere in there that it says, stop doing what you're doing and do this instead. So if you are that nervous NOAA scientist who thinks, oh, what's this roadmap mean for me? Hopefully it means that you can continue to do the good work you're doing already, and that over the course of these roadmap iterations, that work is going to be more easy to work into these long-range plans for EBFM. All right, so let's extend that metaphor a little bit and talk about the Integrated Ecosystem Assessment, or IEA. So we've got a map that the EBFM policy has provided us. Well, what comes next? Well, if you've got a map, that map should show you where to go, as I just described, and the IEA is one way to get there. Over just a few short years, the Integrated Ecosystem Assessment in NOAA has staked its reputation as a sleek, stylish research machine, a turbocharged, high-performance thoroughbred of collaborative, transdisciplinary science capable of going from 0 to 60 in just one 3-letter acronym. Well, actually, no. That would be nice if our metaphorical way of moving science forward was as cool as this Bugatti, but in reality, it's probably a little bit more like something less flashy, like a hybrid Toyota RAV4. because IEA isn't a flashy science tool. It's not this solution to all of our problems. It is simply a practical, forward-looking research tool. It's a framework for prioritizing, coordinating, and integrating science in support of EBFM. And it has several steps that I'll list here and then go through in more detail. It defines our goals and objectives in collaboration with managers and stakeholders. It helps us to select and monitor indicators of ecosystem status. We assess risks related to those goals and objectives. We compare management alternatives and assess trade-offs for trying to meet those objectives. And then we start it all over again to make sure that once we've put some management actions to work, that they're doing what we intended them to do to meet our objectives. So why am I specifically highlighting IEA? I mentioned that it is a tool among many tools that NOAA Science uses. Why do I call it out? Why do I give it the fun car metaphor? Well, mainly it's because NOAA has invested an awful lot in the IEA approach. We have an IEA program that's been in place since 2010. So that's a major investment of time and energy and people that spans the entire country, basically. We have teams in New England, in the Gulf of, or in the Northeast, pardon me, in the Gulf of Mexico, on the West Coast, Alaska, and Hawaii. And the framework was also designed expressly to help organize and guide science in support of EBFM. It's its whole purpose, and it now has 10 years almost of legacy of working on this kind of science to show for it. And guess what? It also complements the roadmap very well. So it makes sense for me to highlight it and talk about some of the good things that are being done in it. To get a little better perspective of how it complements the roadmap and talk about those guiding principles a little bit more, let's take a peek under the hood of the IEA car here and get a close-up look at its engine. Its engine here is this framework, these are the same steps that I listed in the previous slide, but let's look at them in a little bit more detail, and let's line them up with those guiding principles I mentioned for the EBFM roadmap. The first guiding principle of the EBFM roadmap is to focus on ecosystem-level planning, and that's very similar to the first step of the IEA framework, which is to define goals and targets. Over on the right here, the second guiding principle of the policy and the roadmap is to advance our understanding of ecosystem processes, which aligns very well with the idea of identifying and developing indicators that we use to assess an ecosystem in the IEA framework. Next is guiding principle 3, which is to prioritize the vulnerabilities and risks that both the ecosystem experiences and that our societal goals and objectives for that ecosystem also face, which lines up again well with the third step of the IEA framework of analyzing uncertainty and risk. Principles 4 and 5 are to explore trade-offs in different management strategies and then to apply what we've learned in the ecosystem to our management advice, which is very similar to the evaluating strategies stage of the IEA loop and this internal loop of applying those ideas to implementing management actions and following them as they cycle through the system. And then finally, speaking of cycling, you see both the IEA loop looks like a continuing iterative cycle. That matches up well with the last guiding principle of the EBFM policy, which is to maintain resilient systems. We're not going to do this one time and then quit. We're going to keep working on it and keep maintaining it. So these principles of the policy and the IEA are, I think, really, really well aligned with each other. So let's hop back to our car metaphor and talk a little bit more about the people that are in that car. You might be thinking, if you're a NOAA scientist or if you're just a scientist in general or someone who's interested in all these, that this all sounds good, this research idea sounds great, but I'm not a part of it. And is that a problem? Do I have a role to play in this whole thing? Well, in my opinion, no, it's not a problem at all, because you remember IEA is a tool, it's a framework, and anyone can use it. It's not some proprietary thing within that program. Although folks who have been using the IEA approach in NOAA have learned some do's and don'ts over the years. And I think one of the most critical lessons that we've learned at the Northwest Center is on collaboration. And to illustrate that, I think at the start of the IEA process here on the West Coast, about 10 years ago, a lot of the people that were involved were field scientists, field ecologists, like this diver here. Of course, the IEA framework is an elaborate one. It requires a lot of collaboration to make it happen. So we collaborated often with other field ecologists. And to round out our collaborations, we needed more people, so we tended to get more field ecologists. And although the work that was done in those early stages of the West Coast IEA was quite good, it was somewhat limited in scope because so many, not all, but so many of the participants were ecologists. And so while we were doing good work that honored that the principles of EBFM and of the roadmap, the perspective was limited. So as the IEA approach continues to mature, what I would say we need is a bigger vehicle that seats more people. You might still have that field ecologist in it, but now that field ecologist can be joined by, say, a physical oceanographer. They can also be joined by an economist and should be joined by as many different types of social scientists as possible. It's imperative to have a good climate scientist or scientists in this, as well as someone who specializes in something like governance or political systems or policy. It's great to have people that are specialists in habitat, and we can all use as many ecosystem modelers as possible to help us tie all these things together. So now our IEA van has a lot more diversity of perspectives and opinions and skills in it, and a much broader view of what is involved in EBFM now that more of those viewpoints are represented. And this is important because fully integrated IEA science has to consider lots of different aspects of an ecosystem, both the natural side, the physical processes, the habitat, and the integrity of the ecology, as well as the human side, the societal drivers that are somewhat beyond our control, the local social systems that we have somewhat more say over, and then the desired endpoint of high human well-being. And then finally, in the middle, we have to consider the only thing that we really can effectively manage, which is our own activities. So having as many good, diverse opinions in our IEA team as possible to address this broad range of factors that are a part of ecosystem science is really essential for fully integrated EBFM science. To step back a second and look back at our friend the sablefish here and the assessment we were talking about before, just to put this in the context of EBFM and IEA again, a stock assessment biologist again is going to be looking at these data sources that affect the population of that fish to support the stock status estimates and the harvest policy, and that's great. That's exactly what they're supposed to do. That's what's made U.S. fisheries science management, fishery science and fisheries management successful. But from the perspective of the folks in that IEA van, there's more to it than just the central population biology of that animal. There's also these 7 types of ecosystem factors that I mentioned before that are affecting that fish and that fishery, and that fish and that fishery are also affecting those other things to different extents. And so it's really important that we put all these pieces together in such a way that it helps us manage that species better and manage this entire ecosystem better. The endpoint is not just the fish and how much we can catch, it's these other ecosystem factors as well. We can be a little bit more specific about these terms if we want to here. I'll just put a finer point on it that we think about. Rather than just ecosystem integrity, we might think about productivity and the status of ecologically linked species. Rather than just thinking broadly about habitat, we can start to focus in on factors that are important, like hypoxia, let's say, and physical processes such as the temperature and circulation that affect the amount of young that a population produces. Human activities is a very broad topic, but maybe we think more specifically about important things like the amount of bycatch, the importance of shifting fishery effort from into or out of this particular fishery. Human well-being is another very general notion, but we can think of more specifics like the safety of fishers at sea, how they identify as fishers of this particular species or a particular gear type, and how that identity affects their own satisfaction with their careers and with where they live, and also the social vulnerability of the towns that they live in. Local social systems, more specifically, might be thought of as changes in fishery management or changes in your economy in your hometown. Societal drivers include things like global markets and fuel prices. And taking all of these things into account to the extent that they are influencing this population it's a good way to provide context for the managers that have to take that stock assessment information and decide, is this the only important piece of information, or are there other context factors out there like these ones that we've got on the screen here? It also helps us narrow down what the most important drivers are that could be used in something like an IEA risk assessment, or to give some information for ecosystem models that could be used to provide management advice and compare alternate management strategies that take some of these things into account, like variability in the ecosystem or like changes in the amount of fishing pressure. So this is the perspective that we hope as ecosystem scientists we can add to complement the stock assessment process. Now, one takeaway from that is certainly that the IEA team needs to make sure that there are stock assessment biologists in the van with us that are going to further broaden our perspective on EBFM. The roadmaps are excellent opportunities, I think, for stock assessors and IEA scientists to work together, not least of which because we have a common objective, which is responsible stewardship of valuable fish and fisheries. And furthermore, I think the stock assessment improvement plan that NOAA produced earlier this year recognizes this. So you can see in this conceptual diagram that I pulled out of that stock assessment improvement plan, right there in the middle, that stock assessments and integrated ecosystem assessments are intended to work in parallel with one another to support EBFM and eventually become interwoven to provide management advice based both on the health of the population of fish that we're fishing, as well as that context of what's going on in the rest of the ecosystem, to provide more well-rounded management advice. And just want to remind you again that it really is important that we're thinking here not just of single species, but that we're trying to use these approaches for fully integrated ecosystem management in pursuit of ecosystem goals. And it's not just stock assessments where I think the roadmap and the IEA approach can benefit us. We also, as an agency, are focused very much on the importance of variability and change in our climate. And NOAA even has released a climate science strategy that I can't say that I'm terribly personally involved in it, so I don't want to try to go into any kind of detail about that, other than to say that climate science is very much a component of overall ecosystem science, and the same prioritization processes and steps that are taken in the guiding principles of the roadmap, and the same kind of science framework that we use in the IEA fits very well with advancing climate science in support of better fisheries management and better management of the oceans. So what about transformational ideas? That was another one of the things that I mentioned back at the top of the talk. Transformational ideas first came to our attention, I think, earlier this year, when after the EBFM policy had come out and started to really take shape, our our chief scientist in NOAA Fisheries, Cisco Werner, asked each of the fisheries science centers and regions to identify at least 2 ways that EBFM would transform their work. And so how does that relate to the roadmap, and how does that relate to the IEA framework? Well, let's do some more metaphors here. One of the ways that I think EBFM can transform what we do is just the process by which we conduct our science, where we may have done things like this, taking this route historically, but EBFM might encourage us, or the roadmap might encourage us to take other pathways that are potentially more effective. Another thing that's transformative is the kinds of tools we use, where over here in the left corner, we might transform the kinds of approaches we take to more technologically updated ones that help us to do our jobs better, or other more refined science tools that help us do our job better. Another transformational idea comes over here in the lower right corner, where rather than just focusing on EBFM, Ecosystem-Based Fisheries Management, maybe this process encourages us to look more broadly at ecosystem-based management of the entire ocean as our objective, as we start to realize how fisheries interact with other sectors, like, say, energy development or transportation or tourism or things like that. And finally, transformation could take us out of this box altogether, as the ideas of ecosystem science and ecosystem management can continue to evolve. We might be doing something very different 10 years from now than what we're focusing on at present. I would dare say that the transformational ideas that we are identifying as ways to help us, figure out our objectives for the first iteration of the roadmap, they're going to evolve over time, and they will help guide development of new objectives and new visions. And if you have thoughts or ideas that you think are transformative about the way ecosystem science and ecosystem management is done, this is a really good time to make those ideas known to colleagues in NOAA or other agencies, or to fishery management councils or academics. It's a really important thing to do. So I'm going to stretch the metaphor a little bit further now, possibly close to a breaking point, with something that's personally a concern to me, and this is an idea that I've certainly am talking with a couple of colleagues here in the West region and then back at headquarters about, which is the dilemma I think we face with information flow as we start to take on these more complex issues of ecosystem-based science and management. So in the stock assessment process, we've identified 4 really key groups, I think, to making an assessment happen. You have the stakeholders, groups like commercial and recreational fishers, people involved in something like aquaculture, environmental nonprofits and non-governmental organizations, and folks involved in ecotourism and things like that. You also have the scientists, like our crowd from the IEA van in the lower left. We have fishery management councils that provide recommendations on policy and harvest policy based on the assessments that they hear and review and other information that they get. And then finally, you have the regional offices and policy-making side of NOAA that implements the recommendations from councils according to national laws. And the stock assessment process is really well established among these 4 stakeholders, so that the process happens according to a calendar and a schedule that's very well planned and intended to generate timely policy. So there's super effective, and from what I can tell anyway, super effective communication and information flow in the assessment process that NOAA has and the councils use to manage marine species. In the case where ecosystem dynamics and ecosystem change become important, however, let's say there's some big change that comes along, and I'm concerned that when those big changes come along that cause some really profound effect that falls outside of the ability of the traditional system to deal with, that communication is going to break down and get replaced by a lot of people that are aware that things are going on but don't really know who to talk to about it, or aren't working on things at the same time scale, let's say. So like the stakeholders, for example, are going to recognize an ecosystem change, especially if you're, say, a commercial fisher. You're going to recognize that something is different probably a long time before the scientists do. Not entirely, but a lot of scientists are going to take a little bit longer to figure this out than the fishermen are. And then all that information has to flow through the other channels to groups like the council in the region. So things can really slow down here, I'm concerned, without some thought to how information is supposed to flow. And just to give you perhaps the worst metaphor of this whole thing, let's talk about the importance of getting information flow done in a orderly and timely way. And the metaphor here is we've got our map, we've got our van, and let's make our objective to get to Grandma's house. Grandma's house is right here in the center of this map. And we have a list of 5 activities that we need to do to get to Grandma's house. We need to take these 5 steps, 5 actions. So let's see how we do here. Let's start. We're going to go north. Okay. Take the right of the stop sign. We're all good. Continue straight. Take the second right. And we have arrived. And so we've taken our 5 actions. We've done them successfully. And we've achieved our desired outcome, which is to get to Grandma's house. Let's try that again. And let's do the exact same 5 actions, but let's switch the order up a little bit. And now, let's see how we do. We're going to drive north, blow through this stop sign, but that's okay. Take the second right, and then turn right at the stop sign and continue straight. And we have arrived. And this is not the desired outcome. It's the exact same 5 actions that we took, but we didn't do them in the same order, and it doesn't end well. And this is a fairly silly and coarse metaphor, but I think you can think of a similar idea where, let's say, a council needs advice 12 months from now on some ecosystem perturbation or some change in the ecosystem, and it's going to take the Science Center 6 months to figure out who can do the analysis, and then another 18 months to actually do the analysis. The council is going to be forced to make decisions based on information that is best available, but there could be better information out there. It's just taking the Science Center longer than the management system needs to generate it. So the same actions are going to get done, but they're going to get done in a different order, and the outcome might not be what we're hoping for. So I hope that metaphor wasn't too tired, and we're getting close to the end here, so you won't have to put up with this anymore, too much anymore. The key takeaways, though, are just that the order and timing of activities matters a lot. And it would be good for us, I think, in the management system to study the pathways of information flow to see where efficiencies and inefficiencies are. And I'm sure there are experts out there who know how to do these kinds of studies and tell us where we can improve matters of information flow. I think we should be prepared to triage because there are going to be certain kinds of ecosystem variation that we can study that is gradual, and there are going to be other kinds that require immediate action, and it's quite likely that the pathways of information flow will need to be different depending on the severity and the immediacy of some ecosystem crisis. I think it's important that we involve lots of people in all of these stakeholder groups, these 4 groups that are in the background there, because it adds perspective, it adds skill, and it spreads the workload around, and that's very important in today's NOAA, I think. And finally, I think it's just important generally that we collaborate, all these 4 groups together, collaborate to develop clear ecosystem objectives and plans. And that will help us, I think ahead to where the information flow needs to be in order to make those objectives meetable and those plans achievable and sustainable. So kind of closing up here, as we take up the EBFM policy, as we travel along the roadmap, as we fire up the IEA and other research tools, setbacks are going to be inevitable. There's going to be times when the roadmap takes us to a place that we didn't anticipate, or that turns out to not have been a very fruitful idea or objective. There's going to be times when the science tools that we're using prove not as effective as we were hoping for the objectives that we are trying to achieve. There's going to be times when the objectives themselves seem to be moving targets, and it's very hard to adjust to a target that's constantly moving. Or even if they're stable, there's going to be times when there are multiple competing objectives, and we have to prioritize which one we want to devote our energies to. And that's all daunting, but setbacks are inevitable in any type of science, and I really don't think that should stop us from trying to do this. And all of this really is to say that as NOAA scientists do their work in its great diversity and are constantly hearing about EBFM, that they try to take time to think about it and think about how they can get involved in it, because it's really important. It makes our work better. It gives us more places and more applications for it to be applied. And I know that in getting to work with other ecosystem science and getting to be a passenger in this van, it's made me a better scientist, and it's made my science better. Those are not exactly the same thing, and I hope you appreciate the nuance there. It's really important that we put all of our strengths together like this, because these big multidisciplinary projects help us tackle bigger problems that we know are critical to society. And if you are concerned that there's not enough room for you, for your type of science and your discipline and your interests in this van, I would say there is. And if it turns out that maybe there's not, just let us know and we'll get a bigger van, because this is important, and we need diverse skill sets to tackle these diverse problems. And that is the end of the metaphors and the end of my presentation, and I really appreciate your attention. It's odd to give a presentation like this to a telephone and a computer, and I hope it was easy to understand and follow, and that you enjoyed it.
Thank you so much, Chris. That's an excellent overview of what we've been doing here, and a great summation. We really enjoyed the cartoons, but a summation of the past talks that we've had here on these monthly series. So I really appreciate everything you've done in pulling this together. We have an opportunity for folks here in the room in the Silver Spring NOAA headquarters library to offer questions. And Christelle's putting some questions that have come in via the web. So we do have some questions here, quite a number of them.
Lots of videos.
Okay, Stacy, Chris, I'm turning to you to see if you can read it. It's a lengthy question there, and I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time reading it on screen.
Do it.
Can you see it, Chris?
Hi, Chris. I'm Christelle. So I have a question from Paul Stacy, asking, saying that he loves the visual and the metaphor, but I can't help but think that the IEA van is carrying out of control. The big stick of management is pretty much harvest and precisely implemented, especially with the unpredictability of future stock conditions. Uncertainty can be attributed to a variety of stressors that have nothing to do with CAT, that cannot be effectively controlled or modulated, kind of like having a gas pedal in the van, a dirty windshield with no wiper, and no steering wheel. Can we reasonably expect any difference in outcome with an ecosystem-based approach with severe navigation limitations? I hope so, but it seems a heavy lift.
Wow, that's a existential question there. I think so. I agree in general with the notion that if we step back pretty far, that the difficulty of EBFM science and management can feel like it's too much. And I think one thing that the IEA program, in my experience, has been trying to do is not to try to tackle everything at once. And I'm not sure this is going to be a satisfactory answer, but to try to identify specific objectives, specific problems. There's a good example going in the Gulf of Mexico right now with the need to divert sediment away from where it has been going at the mouth of the Mississippi River to help restore soil, to help prevent or reduce soil erosion and rebuild coastal soil, coastal habitat, and improve other conditions in the water quality in the nearshore. So rather than trying to manage the entire Gulf of Mexico, let's say with an ecosystem approach, start with specific questions, specific objectives, specific wicked problems, if you will, and use these methods to try to focus on them directly rather than trying to manage the entire system at once. I think that is a way forward, is to try to bite this off in chunks rather than to try to do it all at once. And I'm not sure if that answers or gets to the heart of this very difficult matter that you bring up, but that's the approach I would recommend for IEA.
Thanks, Chris. I did turn to someone in the room here if anybody has questions here in the library. Okay, going back to the web, we have a couple of questions coming in. Is there room for indigenous science and knowledge, if any, in these processes? And that's from Rebecca Reuter.
Yes, I can certainly tell you in the West Coast, the California Current IEA, our colleagues Melissa Poe and many of her collaborators have been working very closely with tribal communities to try to integrate both local and traditional ecological knowledge, as well as objectives of indigenous peoples into matters related to, say, ocean acidification, and then I know that's also been an important approach in Alaska and in Hawaii, and I don't doubt that it's important in other regions too. But really, one of the key objectives, I think, in the whole the first step of the IEA loop of identifying objectives and goals is to make sure that we get all of those viewpoints included and all those objectives included, so that when it comes to matters like doing trade-off analysis, we know which different kinds of communities are being affected both favorably and adversely by management decisions, and indigenous peoples are an essential part of that.
Okay, next question online here is, how do you see EBFM being applied to fishery management plans?
Well, in the case of the West Coast, with which I'm most familiar, we are about to, I think anyway, we're about to get into the updating of the fishery ecosystem plan, which is intended to provide some guidance for and objectives for how to implement more ecosystem objectives into the fishery management plans. That's to be determined how that's going to really play out, because that review and revision process is only just starting. At the level of FMPs, certainly within individual assessments, I think we're seeing with more and more monitoring data that have come in time series that have gotten longer and longer. I think the statistical tools for identifying patterns that and hopefully mechanisms too that can go into and improve an assessment, so there can be environmental prediction of things like recruitment, is getting more and more important. I think also we're seeing more ecosystem science with respect to the spatial distribution of different species. So we can start to see how different variation in the environment leads to fish distributions changing. And then once those distributions change, we can start to anticipate that certain ports are going to be affected, where that species distribution is shifted further from them or closer to them, which is going to affect their fishing opportunities. And so what I would say is that EBFM can help with issues like in the assessment, if there's environmental drivers of variability in the population or its recruitment success, and also start to give better ideas of how to allocate some of that catch, because distributions of fish are moving around and certain ports are going to be winners and others might have to look at other opportunities or other resources to fish.
Okay, looks like we have about 3 questions, and I think we could probably do that before the hour is up here, Chris. The next one online really addresses using the terms for different audiences. The focus of the talk has been to a scientific audience, and the question is here, what kind of terms are used for other groups? And I don't know if you want to take that offline or try to address that here.
Yeah, that's a good question. I definitely did write this talk and make this talk with a audience of fellow scientists in mind. But clearly, the approach I took is I think intended to be a little bit more open to anybody, and I would love some direct feedback offline on how I could do that, because I think this is potentially a good way for at least for me to do some outreach to stakeholders and other groups, and I would love to be educated on how I can do that better.
Thanks, Chris. We have 2 more here. One person is asking about the scope of the program. In order for this program to be effective, global support is necessary due to many fisheries of interest lying in international waters. I wondered if you want to speak to that.
Yeah, I can certainly say a couple things about that. I know the IEA approach is not unique to the United States. That we have partners in Europe for sure that are adopting this approach, and then there are many countries around the world that I think the IEA approach, and probably the EBFM approach too, has benefited greatly from excellent work being done places like Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and Chile, Argentina, and East Asia. So there are a lot of places that are doing this, and the framework that I presented here depends very much on other frameworks that have been developed elsewhere and builds on them. And so I think this should be the kind of thing that can be done elsewhere. And there's also some encouraging research that a colleague of ours, Beth Fulton in Australia, has done that shows that even if there are ecosystems that straddle international boundaries, if EBFM approaches are being taken in on one side of the border, the ecosystem as a whole should benefit from it, even in ways that spill over. So the effort, even in international waters, I think the effort can be demonstrated to be worth it in at least in models, and we'll find out, I guess, as we continue to monitor ecosystems if that's borne out with data.
Okay, and our last question, Chris, is looking for a clear difference between policy-wise or practically between EBFM and EAFM. Want to address that?
Wow, I guarantee you right now I would get that wrong if I tried.
Okay,
I hate to
get offline, and the person's name is there. You can respond to them directly if you'd like to have an exchange.
I'd be quite happy to. Yeah.
Great, Chris. Thanks.
And frankly, I mean, just to honestly, to me, those definitions get very blurry very quickly. So, and partly it's because I probably haven't brushed up on that those definitions in a while, but even when I do, they get pretty blurry pretty quickly for me. And I'm sure there are folks there at headquarters that are writing a reprimand up for me right now. But I'll be happy to check in offline.
Great, Chris. Thank you so much. Appreciate all the time and effort. This is an excellent presentation. Good way to sum up much of what our presentations have been over the last year. So again, thank you for your efforts on that. Just quickly again, our next presentation is November 14th, same time, same place. The folks from the Pacific Regional Office and Science Center will be talking about scaling science to support their ecosystem-based management activities in the Western Hawaii. And again, to reiterate what Chris had said earlier, our thoughts are with our colleagues and their families in the Southeast, and hopefully they'll ride out this storm safely. And again, thanks again to Chris and all the attendees for participating today. And thanks to the NOAA Library folks who have been great. And FYI, these presentations are archived at the NOAA Library website. You can go back and look at past presentations. In some cases, the PowerPoint, the audio, and sometimes the transcripts are there. And I'm looking at the folks here in NOAA Library who are nodding their heads yes, they're all there. And this will be posted probably within 24 or 48 hours at the latest. So if you know colleagues that were unable to join us today, please let them know that they can go to that website and see these presentations. And again, thanks. And we look forward to your comments too. You have an opportunity to comment on each of these presentations and suggestions for future topics. So thank you again.